Alright, welcome back to part 2 of our evolution screencast. I had some technical difficulties towards the end of our last one, but here we'll pick up where we left off with number 4 of Darwin's theory. For an increasing number of individuals in succeeding generations will have these adaptive characteristics since the characteristics are advantageous to the survival of that species. More individuals in subsequent generations will possess that trait, as the individual who survive to reproductive age will be those with that trait. This process of environmental influences causing an adaptive characteristic to become more prevalent in a population is called natural selection. Darwin described his theory in the form of a long essay which he called On the Origin of Species. Darwin was so fearful of the response of the public to the contents of his essay and his theory of evolution, remembering what had happened to Galileo, who had been ostracized from the scientific community at large for suggesting the Earth revolved around the sun, his heliocentrism theory. Darwin arranged for On the Origin of Species to be published after his death. However, under some pressure from some of his colleagues who saw that other scientists might be publishing similar discoveries, Darwin published On the Origin of Species before his death in 1859, and he published it because he and his colleagues wanted for him to be credited with the precedence of the theory of evolution. So here we have two pictures of Darwin at age 50 in 1859 when On the Origin of Species was published, and here just 15 years later you can see that he is significantly aged, most likely from the stress of the public response to his theory in 1874. Again, here's another character drawing of the public's perception of Darwin after the publication of his theory. So now let's return to the Galapagos Islands. As we've said previously in class and the screencast, this is where Darwin made significant observations in the formulation of his theory and how species changed over time due to natural selection. So that is a map of the Galapagos Island. As you can see, there's several smaller islands throughout. And here are Darwin's observations on the beaks of the finches on the Galapagos. So there were different finch species spread across the several different Galapagos Islands, where some finches' beaks had adapted for eating seeds, others had been adapted for eating grubs, insects, buds or fruit, leaves, and even some finches who used tools in their beaks. All these adaptations were advantageous to the finches, dependent upon which island they inhabited in the Galapagos. Natural selection is governed by the principles of genetics. The change in the frequency of a gene in a given population leads to a change in a population and may result in the emergence of a new species. Natural selection operates on populations over many generations. So let's remember what we said in class, that natural selection is not random. Mutations and genetics are random, but natural selection is not a random act. Here we'll talk about Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. He was a French naturalist, soldier, biologist, and academic, and an early proponent of evolution. He accepted the ideas that an organism can pass on characteristics that it acquired during its lifetime to its offspring. So while Lamarck was a proponent of evolution, just like Darwin, they both had differences of opinion about what evolution was, and that's okay. This is a fundamental tenet of science. Ideas must be compared and contrasted and then tested to see which idea prevails through evidence that supports which opinion is more right. Here we can see that Lamarck believed in the use and disuse of characteristics. These characteristics were acquired and transmitted, and that subsequent generations increased in complexity, and that species didn't go extinct, they simply evolved. So this is similar to that misconception we had in class when we did our adaptation activity, that some of us thought that if we took a white-tailed rabbit from San Diego and placed it in the Arctic of Alaska, that it would simply adapt. But no species possesses the ability to simply change its genetic code and suddenly be able to survive in an entirely different climate. So Darwin conversely believed in genetic variation, that traits either were inherited or they were not inherited. So when an organism is born, they either have that trait and adaptation, or they do not. That there was differential survival of populations, and that species that did not have adaptive characteristics would eventually go extinct. Evolution. So let's define evolution. We've discussed it quite a bit now. The development of the theory, certainly. It is a change in successive generations of organisms due to random mutations and changes in the organism's surroundings. Evolution takes place through a set of processes that include mutations, adaptations, natural selection, and extinction. Here to the right, we can see a diagram of the evolution of modern horses, whose distant ancestor, the Hyracotherium from 50 million years ago, then 25 million years ago, the Mesohippus, and Hipparion 8 million years ago, and the most recent ancestor of horses, the Pleiohippus, 4 million years ago. And the modern equus, or horse, as we see over this 50 million year timeline, the species' adaptive characteristics as a result of mutations, longer legs, broader shoulders, longer snouts, different coloring patterns. This is a simplistic view of the evolution of horses. And let's remember that the true evolution was much more complex, and it involved many more variants along the lineage of evolution, and that other species of animals we know today may have diverged from Hyracotherium. One that comes to mind that is a good example would be zebras, as they possess many similar characteristics to horses, but they are not the same species as horses. Patterns of evolution. We have different patterns of evolution. It's important to know the distinctions between the two. We have divergent evolution, the pattern of evolution in which species that once were similar to an ancestor became increasingly distinct. This is the pattern of evolution that led to the polar bear and the grizzly bear diverging from their common ancestor of another more bear, becoming two different species as described in the episode of Cosmos we watched. Additionally, this is how humans and apes became distinct from their shared common ancestor. Convergent evolution, on the other hand, is when unrelated species occupy similar environments in different parts of the world. A good example of convergent evolution is to think about birds, bats, and insects. All these organisms possess wings, which are an analogous appendage, and the capability of flight. However, the most recent common ancestor of these three organisms did not possess that common trait of wings and flight. Each species diverged and evolved from that common ancestor and became distinct species on their own. And then later in their evolutionary history, they adapted the ability of flight and the adaptation of wings. All have an analogous structure which enables them to perform the same ability, but they develop that trait independent of their common ancestors' genetics. Mutation. We've already talked a bit about mutation in our discussion in class. Genetic mutations and variety produced by sexual reproduction offer diversity within a given population. Many factors can cause a change in a gene over time. Mutations can be both beneficial and detrimental to a species population. Only those mutations which benefit the survival of the species will be selected as traits that adapt to the population. Mutations are important factors in how populations change over time because they increase variance in the gene pool. Here in our photo, we've got several wild boars with different characteristics. The letter B upper and lowercase represent different alleles of the boar's genetics. The uppercase letter is a dominant allele, and the lowercase letter is the recessive allele. Dominant and recessive alleles and their different combinations result in different haplotypes and phenotypes. A haplotype is the combination of alleles together in the boar's genetic code, and the phenotype is the physical expression of the characteristic of those alleles. So you can see up above that we have some lighter furred boars and darker furred boars. So it would be safe to say that our letter B is perhaps coding for the fur color of, or the fur pattern of the boar. We'll delve further into these haplotypes, phenotypes, and alleles when we discuss genetics in class. Mutations are inheritable changes because a mutation is a change in the DNA code. DNA is the genetic material that is different in every individual organism. No two organisms have exactly the same genetic material with the exception of identical twins and triplets or any identical organisms. When organisms sexually reproduce, they swap genetic material, and the organism or organisms they reproduce get a new code based off both parents' genetic material. Mutation can result Mutation can result in favorable change or adaptation in genetic information that improves the species' ability to exist in its environment. Perhaps spiny thorns on cactus enable those plants to survive by discouraging herbivores from consuming them in desert environments. Mutations can also result in unfavorable change that does not improve a species' ability to exist in its environment. Here we have some turtles with albinism, or albino turtles. Albinism results in organisms being incredibly sensitive to the light of the sun, especially in their eyes. Individuals with albinism typically either have very poor eyesight or maybe may be blind entirely. Individuals can live with albinism. They simply lack the pigment melanin, which causes our skin to tan and protects us from the sun. Mutations can also be neither harmful nor detrimental to the species. Here we have an example of white roses and roses that contain some pink pigmentation. This is similar to characteristics in humans like blue eyes and brown eyes, or blonde hair, red hair, or black hair. None of these characteristics either benefit or harm humans. They simply are variants in our genetics. So we've been about 12 minutes in. We will pause there and just be prepared for our third screencast where we will pick up with adaptation.